And as the name suggests, they're graduate attributes, which means we expect the students upon graduation to have these attributes. That is, a basic knowledge in math, natural science, and engineering science, an ability to undertake problem analysis, to undertake investigation, an ability to design complex engineering problems, the use of engineering tools, to be able to work in isolation as a member of a team, to be able to communicate effectively, orally, both orally and in written, to demonstrate professionalism, to have an understanding of the impact of their actions on society and the environment. Obviously, ethics and equity is important, and we expect the graduates to be able to perform economic analysis and be able to undertake project management situations. And again, we expect them to continue to have lifelong learning and recognize when they need to get additional training. Continual improvement is the second part of the outcomes. Engineering programs are expected to continually improve. There must be processes in place that demonstrate that program outcomes are being assessed in the context of the graduate attributes, and that results are applied to further development of the program. And needless to say, if outcomes are not consistent with desired attributes, then system inputs and process must be adjusted. Within the last year, I mentioned earlier, we felt it necessary to provide a guidance to institutions, but we also felt it important to provide a guidance to our program visitors. So we developed a guide, which again I'll be making more reference to a little bit later, for program visitors. And essentially what it is, it's a guide of questions that they should be asking themselves when they're performing outcomes assessments of an engineering program. Now, some of the things that we look for under information requirements, for example, on outcomes assessment for graduate attributes, we look for curriculum mapping, we look for assessment tools, we look at attribute indicators, and the methods of data collection. For the continual improvement process, we're interested in the compilation of results, the stakeholder consultation process, the triggers that warrant or that cause action, and we're interested in actions that are implemented. I'm going to touch on each of these in a little bit more detail. I think I do want to point out though, but for the graduate attribute headings, and again, a reminder, we have 12 attributes. We request specific information on each of those 12 attributes. The continual improvement process is a much more holistic approach, but the graduate attributes, there's a lot of detail provided. So if I look at curricular improvement, and this is a busy slide, but what we ask institution to provide, or what a curriculum map is, it's simply a plotted representation, as seen on the table here, that shows the relationship between learning activities and intended learning outcomes. And what I mean by learning activities, these are essentially courses over here, and they're shown, it goes from term 1 to term 8. So we have 4 years of courses, and those are the courses, if you will, or co-ops or projects or labs or some sort of learning activity, if you will, that demonstrates or addresses the graduate attributes. And on this column here, I've only shown 4 of the 12 graduate attributes, but you can see the plot between these are the courses throughout the 4 years of instruction that address each specific graduate attribute. Now I'm going to go right into, for example, into the design one. So I'll pick design. And in design, our design definition, design solutions for complex open-ended problems, systems, components, or processes with attention to health and safety, risks, economic environment, and social considerations. So here you can see over the 4 years, all of the courses that are designed to provide or show compliance to each of those components within the design definition. And what's also plotted are the actual courses that have been selected, which the university has selected to demonstrate that this particular attribute in all its components have been satisfied. Another plot, and this is a very busy plot, but this is a plot of attribute indicators and learning activities. Again, learning activities, you'll hear me say learning activities and courses. So what we have here is a plot of indicators, and simply the indicators are descriptors of what the students must do to be considered competent in that particular attribute. And normally what we would have 3 or 4 indicators for each particular graduate attribute. So conceivably, we would have probably 50 to 60 indicators for all of the attributes. You can see under the program knowledge, there's a large number of indicators provided by this institution because, once again, demonstrated competent in math, natural sciences, and engineering sciences. So there tends to be more indicators within general knowledge. But again, we ask them to show us the plot of courses, but also the level, if you will, of exposure, whether it's a basic exposure, whether it's an intermediate exposure, or whether it's an advanced exposure. Needless to say, the further the student goes, or your advanced tends to be 3rd and 4th year courses where the exposure is, or the expectation is much more onerous. Again, simply going to design, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but in the case of design, to satisfy the definition of design, this particular institution had 4 indicators. These are the courses that were assessed, if you will, for each of the various indicators and the various levels of which the assessment was done or undertaken. Again, a busy plot, but we'll get into design here. This is assessment tools. And what I mean by assessment tools, those are the devices used to develop the sources of data in which student learning is based. That could be tests, for example. It could be quizzes, examination, reports, rubrics. Again, if you look at, and it's hard to see, but if you look at general knowledge, you can see here that the test is quizzes and exams, and it's measured by a range in which the test results, if you will, which the student receives. If we go into the design graduate attributes, once again, I've just picked one particular indicator. You recall there was 4 indicators for design, but this particular indicator represents the indicator in which design is being measured, not health and safety and some of the others. And once again, you can see we're interested in a plot of the assessment tools, but performance level and level descriptions. And what I mean by that, for example, in this case, this is the level what we require which fails to meet expectations. In other words, if the student cannot satisfy these results, there would be a failure considered. These would be minimum performance levels required. These were adequate performance levels required, and these would be expectations that exceed requirements. So again, it's a detailed process, a lot of information the institutions have to provide, but that's what we expect in a tabular form from institutions, for example, dealing with assessment tools. So, in addition to the tabular information, we expect the university to spend a fair bit of time providing us detailed information as well on curriculum mapping. And what we ask is to discuss the specific characteristic of each learning activity, again, or course, that justifies the mapping to the attribute and the performance level. So this is the course, this is why I'm using this course for this attribute at this performance level. We ask them to specify the indicator or the indicators that apply to each learning activity. The CEAB does not specify indicators. The institution comes up with their own indicators. We will judge whether we feel the indicators are adequate. And the institution must explain the rationale for the selection of the learning activity where the data is collected, which feeds into the continual improvement process. So again, what do the visiting team look at? Again, this goes back to the guide. So the visitor team for mapping, for example, would say, or ask themselves, does the curriculum map align with the course information sheets? Are the graduate attributes dependent on a single or a limited number of learning activities or courses? Are the assessments reasonably distributed over time? Are assessments reasonably distributed over graduate attributes? And on and on. I won't read them all, but this is a bit of a checklist. It's a guide. It's not really not a checklist. It's not intended to be all-encompassing, this slide, but it provides you with an idea of what the program visitors are expected to take a look at. Again, if we go into assessment tools, we expect the institution to talk about those specific tools I mentioned before, for each course where the data is collected. Why did you use exams? Why did you use a rubric? Why did you use a report? And what evidence did you see that an attribute has been demonstrated? Again, the program visitor, are the performance descriptors well aligned with the graduate attributes? Are there enough descriptors? Are there too many descriptors? Are the performance descriptors distinct and unambiguous? Do the instructors and the students have a common understanding of the descriptors? One of the things that we found, or our experience has been, institutions that tend to provide too many indicators, collect too much information. It's not sustainable. So they quickly learn that we have to reduce and be more precise in terms of what we're looking for, because they just can't compile all the information that they started out thinking they could. Again, let's look at attribute indicators. Again, we want the institutions to explain the rationale behind the selection of the indicators for the attribute and the justification that the indicators are unique to the attribute or a component of the attribute. And explain further how the data collected demonstrates the full scope of the attribute definition. A lot of information to be provided. Again, the visitors, what do they look for? Are the indicators directly relevant to the attributes? Are there enough indicators for the attribute? Are there too many indicators? Are the indicators measurable? Because you have to measure all of these things. So are they in fact measurable? And are the assessment points in the curriculum well chosen? Data collection. Explain how measurements are distributed over the semesters of the program and justify the distribution. Discuss how courses are used in the assessment of the attribute, and justify the presence or absence of duplicate measurements, again in the context of continual improvement. So what does the team look for? Are the assessment results reasonable, considering the sample size? Are there too many fails, considering the sample size? Is the threshold established by the institution between success and failure reasonable? Is the time progression of results reasonable? We expect to see improvement over time. And here we go. Is the data collection process sustainable? Are there too many, too little? It must be sustainable. So if we now look at continual improvements, the previous slides dealt with graduate attributes. Continual improvements. Provide the compiled results of the data collection, including the rationale for the choice of samples in the context of continual improvement. Again, lots of information to provide. In the case of stakeholders, describe the composition of the stakeholder group involved in the decision-making process for program improvements. We expect both internal and external stakeholders to be consulted. Provide the rationale for the selection of the group and the details of the consultation process. So again, the continual improvement process is extremely important. Triggers for action. Explain how the collected data is analyzed and how the decision to act is triggered based on the analysis. In parentheses, you'll see "or not." What we found in many institutions is data is collected, but there's no confidence in the data. So as a result, no decisions are made for change, and that's the right decision. You should only be making decisions if you have confidence in the results of the data. So no decision sometimes is a good decision. We want them to discuss how the level of student performance relative to the program expectation is addressed. Because once again, institutions, they have high benchmarks. The students don't always attain those benchmarks. So there's a need to revisit the benchmarks to see that they're reasonable. Describe the level of actions that are considered at the program level. We're primarily looking at the program level as opposed to course level changes that can be made by professors. Actions implemented. Again, list the program level actions that have been recommended to date, the specific rationale for change, and the accountability and timelines for full implementation. We've changed our criteria here because initially we were looking at, tell us what the changes are going to be. But what we failed to say is, and who's going to be responsible for implementing the change, and how long will they be given for that change to be implemented? So it's not enough to say we're going to change, there has to be a follow-through process. And again, we're not particularly interested in course level actions that can just routinely be addressed by the professors. So the visiting team, again, some of the questions. For results, is the interpretation of the data reasonable? Is there support from the data to justify change? How many cycles of data collection might be needed to justify action? And are alternative assessment tools needed? Oftentimes we find that an institution used the wrong tool to measure results and need to change the assessment tool. In the case of stakeholders, is there sufficient institution or internal, and as well as external stakeholders that are consulted? Is the consultation feedback effective? Triggers. Who decides whether the data supports a decision? Is it made at the program level? Is it made at a faculty level? Is it made somewhere else? Who decides is important. Can actions be implemented without supporting data? What is the role of faculty in making change decisions? Faculty play a huge role in this whole process. We found some, particularly older faculty, perhaps were not so eager to change, but it's important to engage all faculty, and they have to be engaged, obviously, in the decision-making process. And actions. Who is assigned the responsibility for implementing change? Are there timelines? Are there timelines for implementing changes? And is the change implementation process sustainable? So, once we have all of this information, what does the CEAB do with it? We make a holistic assessment on the degree of compliance. We don't require full compliance with all suggested indicators. Again, you saw examples of many, many indicators. It's not expected that all of the indicators are met. We're looking at more on process and that change is taking place. Limited shortcomings may be accepted. Limited shortcomings may be accepted within this holistic approach. And marginal compliance of some attributes is fine. Marginal compliance with all attributes, however, may not be fine. Again, another busy slide. My intent here is not for you to read it. It's simply to point out to you what we have done is we've developed a software program that, and if we look at here at this column here is we're back to curriculum maps, the indicators, the assessment tools, and the assessment results. We have the accreditation criteria descriptions that we follow. Then we have an A and an M and a U. A is acceptable, M is marginal, U is unacceptable. And we have certain levels, if you will, that determine whether you're an A, an M, or a U. And we do this for each of the graduate attributes, and of the 12 attributes, then we pull it all together and come up with, if you will, an assessment of graduate attributes in general. And the same holds true for the continual improvement process. We're interested in the process itself, the stakeholder engagement and the improvement actions, and again, acceptable, marginal, unacceptable levels of compliance. Stakeholder transition challenges, and I think there's only a few slides left. Some of the institutional challenges or concerns that have been raised is the amount of increased workload that is resulting from outcomes assessment, in addition to what we require from input assessments and the AUs. Some institutions desire immediate change to the current curriculum assessment process as we transition to greater reliance on outcomes assessments. And in fact, some institutions like the way we're doing things quite fine and don't want to change anything with respect to inputs. They're quite pleased with the inputs and outputs assessment. The regulatory or licensing agency, for them, there's a bit of a fear of the unknown. Outcomes assessment is new and has not yet proven to be a reliable means of measuring engineering education competency. There's a fear that revamping the current input and curriculum assessment criteria could reduce the quality of the engineering education. They also have come to the realization they need to rely on the CEAB to provide direction and guidance with respect to criteria changes, given this lack of expertise and confidence within the agencies. From our perspective, we need to provide continual guidance for institutions. We need to provide assurances to the licensing agencies that the quality of the engineering education can be assured under outcomes assessment as we move to the reduced reliance on input assessments. We have to provide adequate and consistent training for visiting teams on outcome assessments. And we need to receive continued feedback from stakeholders, and that includes institutions as well as and suggestions for improvements to the graduate attribute continual improvement process. And we do see a need for both input as well as outcomes assessment into the future, but are less reliance on inputs for curriculum measurements. Whoops, last slide. Our system involves both inputs and outputs. Our process is considered by many to be complex and onerous. We've been transitioning since 2008 to outcomes assessment. The current system of both combination of inputs and outputs is creating challenges and concerns to our stakeholders. We're working with these stakeholders to address these challenges. We see that the criteria, compliance assessment, outcomes criteria will continue to evolve as institutions and others become more accustomed to using them. And in the future, foreseeable future, we see less reliance on inputs as stakeholders become more confident in outcomes assessment. Thank you very much.